Okay,
Okay, good.
my name's Chris Fozzard. I'm the Operations Manager of the Budget Motel chain. Thank you very much for joining our webinars. For this one, I'd like to introduce Rod Battye, who's the Managing Manager of Data Innovations and Partnerships for Tourism Research Australia, Austrade. Rod has worked with tourism data for over 20 years and is currently the Vice Chair of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, for Tourism Statistics. Rod is also a member of various committees and work groups with focus on improving data and data governance. Rod, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Yes, that job title is a new one. So for the previous 10 years, I was manager of the national surveys, which is the international and domestic surveys, which I'll show you a little bit of data today, but also we're working on a range of other new data sources as well that we've used. So I'll walk you through a little bit of that. But today, I'll walk you through some of the things I've seen. So obviously, you mentioned there that I've worked with tourism data for over 20 years. And I have to say, there's nothing that looks normal about what's been happening for the last 18 months. We seem to have gone from bushfires and we went into COVID, and it's just been 2 years of very difficult times. And if you look at the data around the country, there's a different story from state to state, from city to region. It all depends on what's happening at the time. So it's been very difficult to keep up with from a point of view of analysing it. But there are some general overall themes. I think the first one is, and I know a lot of your customers will, well, we talk about the international, which has basically been gutted by the border closures and COVID. And over the period, we've lost upwards of $60 billion thus far. So that's obviously still gaining momentum each month, that cumulative loss. But we've also seen some big losses in the domestic and the domestic overnight market's the big one for you guys with your accommodation. So I start with the first slide here. Now, typically in the past, whether it's floods or cyclones or natural disasters, the domestic market tends to recover pretty quickly. And this is a little bit different in that it's going to be patchy, but where the vaccine rates are high and things are starting to lift now. Unfortunately, we missed the school holidays by a little bit, which would have been a good injection, but we're already seeing. So what this first chart shows you is one of the things we did when we started with measuring the COVID period. We looked at new indicators and forward-looking indicators that we could look at to see if we could see what was happening out there in the market before our reporting of our data came out, because there's a bit of a lag. So if you look at that chart, basically the blue columns are the actual domestic overnight trip numbers that we report for domestic overnight trips from our National Visitors Survey. And that's there in millions. So you can see basically the trend where you can see where we've started to recover, and then we had more lockdowns and COVID outbreaks over those periods. But the thing to look at is the yellow or green line at the top there. So what that is, and it tracks very well with the number, it is actually people who had one or more overnight trips, domestic trips in the period. So you'll just see that last little bit of that yellow line into October there, which is if you had the ability to take some school holidays, but also with the lockdowns easing and the restrictions being taken off gradually, we can see that starting to pick up already. So that's good news. And I expect that to spike higher and higher over the coming weeks, hopefully with a bumper holiday season coming up at the end of the year for all of us. I know I'm looking forward to a holiday, I can tell you. And there's many others in my position. And I can also tell you there's a lot of people with built up leave and money that they haven't been able to spend. Some have been spending it in bits and pieces and fits and starts when in between all the different outbreaks and lockdowns. Landscaping companies have been doing well and retail, but there's still, I think there's some money in the kit bag and people really do want to get out and travel. So I'm thinking that's going to be a really good holiday season coming up. And especially with the vaccine rates so high. I think here in Canberra, we're looking at being the highest vaccinated jurisdiction in the world in the coming weeks, which is pretty impressive. But that's good news. That yellow line you see there is starting to turn, and I'd expect, by the way, we published this chart on the TRA website. So if you look up Tourism Research Australia's website under the monthly. So one of the things we also did last year, we used to publish our data quarterly. So from about the middle of last year, we started publishing monthly results. So if you go into our website there, you can follow this, and this chart gets updated weekly. So you'll get to see how that's tracking each week with the trip rates. One of the things with the difference between the blue column, which is the number of trips, and the yellow line is that there's also, people can have multiple trips within the reference period. So that's something to be mindful of. So hopefully people are not only taking overnight trips, they're taking more trips. So typically what we've seen in between the bits and pieces of lockdown, not lockdown, COVID outbreaks, and you'll see in some subsequent slides, is interstate travel has suffered the most. Cities have definitely suffered the most. Regional has done, has also suffered, but nowhere near the losses of the capital cities, which I'll show you. And the big thing is the rebound has always started with the 2 to 4 hour drive market, with intrastate travel and regional. And that's always been the strength of those, the beginning of the rebound. Interstate and air travel always follows the drive market, and that's what we've seen during this period. As I've said, it's a bit of a mixed, whether you go from state to state, city to city and region, there's a different story. There's no consistency to things as we had pre-COVID. So it is a bit of a mixed message story when you go from state to state, as I said, but there's some good news in the opening chart. And I know I live in regional New South Wales myself, and I know in recent times, a lot of that I know some of the people within the accommodation sector relying on business people or people working on wind farms and all sorts of things. And now this weekend, people are booked out, and there's 4 weddings and all sorts of things happening. So it's great to see. So I think there's lots of positive news on the horizon, which is great. So if we ping over to the next slide. So what this slide is showing, it's the domestic overnight losses in billions of dollars, the cumulative losses during the COVID periods, going back to March 2020. The August data, by the way, comes out next week, so this will be updated again on our website to August. But as you can see there with regional Australia, it's kind of been steady along the way, but you're looking at around $10 billion across the country. Compared to the capital cities, you're looking at a far greater amount of loss there, and that's been consistent. And there's some subsequent slides which will talk about that. So really it was around regional travel, regional doing far better, and I think that's the initial rebound will start there as well. Coastal regions are very popular, so for people on those coastal areas, we've seen that during the period, and even during the lockdown period, there's been a higher incidence of people, if they've got holiday homes, choosing to work from home in those locations as well. We've seen some strange things like that, so things that we couldn't explain in the data. And also some of the behaviours have been different as well. So obviously I mentioned that intrastate travel has been the strength of it, but also interstate travel, when that gets going again, whenever those interstate travel was allowable, with all the different regulations in place, because people couldn't go overseas, we also saw some interesting behaviour there, and also higher spend and longer stays. So let's see what happens. There is some sentiment around that I've seen probably a month ago, where people were looking at being a bit more cautious about travelling overseas, and were sort of looking around the 12-month mark rather than charging. I think there'll be some VFR initially, but I think people will be a bit more guarded about going outbound. So I think we'll see some really good stuff in that interstate. And as I said, with all people with so much leave, and hopefully they're cashed up, we'll see some of that stuff we've seen in fits and starts, but a consistent turnaround there. And as I said, hopefully a bumper holiday season coming up. If we go to the next slide, this slide tells you the difference between interstate and intrastate travel. So I mentioned before that most of the loss has been in the interstate market. It is the more lucrative market because it's you tend to have longer stays, and also you've got airfares and other things included in that, and also more business travel. But if you have a look at the losses there, intrastate for domestic overnight, the cumulative losses during COVID has been nowhere near the interstate market there. So pretty much, and in some cases, the intrastate market has actually, in some parts of the country, for example, regional Western Australia, for example, they've done much better. And also at certain times of the year, for example, we've seen areas of the North Coast and along that coastal fringe doing even better than pre-COVID. So particularly with the interstate drive market. So that looks pretty good as well for coming out of the lockdowns. And also, as I said before, with this still going to be a bit of a lag with people taking outbound travel. So hopefully that, you never know, hopefully that turns into more domestic overnight trips. Now, I mentioned before, we're looking at new types of data. So in the next slide, if we go to the next slide, so this will show you a little bit about what was happening and the impact of the lockdown. So this is Sydney, and we know that the cities from the previous slides have been hit far more severely than the regions. And I'm not sure that it'll bounce back as quickly for the cities. As I said, I think the drive market to regional Australia and those coastal regions, you know, what we've seen with the previous COVID, in between the COVID outbreaks and when the lockdowns weren't in place, that they were very popular with domestic overnight travel. So if you have a look at this chart, what this is showing is a week by week blow for Sydney, and the blue lines or the blue columns are comparing that week in 2021 to the pre-COVID period, 2019, that same week. And the green or yellow bar, depending on what it looks like on your screen, that's comparing 2021, the same week, to 2020, which was actually affected by COVID. So you can, as you can see there, in June, Sydney was actually starting to pick up, definitely compared to 2020, but what was on par with 2019 for the same period. And then you saw the start of the outbreak, and then you saw that numbers start to dip and drop away and basically bottomed out. Now, when you get to the week, there was a couple of days there from the lockdown in the week ending 15th of October, and then the first full week got to 22nd of October. You can see that recovery starting already, as you would have seen in the first slide from the trip numbers. So we're expecting that to continue, but again, with Sydney, there's you know, with the lack of business travel, and also there's still that that COVID issue with the numbers still coming out there. So that'll turn people off a little bit as well. If we go to the next slide, which shows you regional New South Wales, again, even better than Sydney. If you look at those earlier figures there, in June, you will have seen numbers looking both better than 2020 and 2019. And so things were starting to pick up. And again, we had the COVID outbreak and the lockdowns. And so things have, obviously, as you can see by the week ending data there, not looking too good. But then, whereas we start to come out of lockdown again, there's a few days in that first week of the 15th of October. We just had a couple of days there. But then you had the first full week to the end of the 22nd of October. And you can already start to see that those lines bending back up. And I'd expect that to continue. And as I said, hopefully lead into a bumper holiday season. Unfortunately, we missed the school holidays in that period there, end of September into October, which usually you see a massive spike. The line goes almost straight up. So that was unfortunate that we missed that, the timing of it. But and then if we go to the next slide, and it's just to show you that before I was talking about the different stories from state to state and region to region, and what's happening there. So Perth is not as affected by or not as reliant on interstate travel as many of the other states. So you'll see their numbers are far less impacted. So this is Perth. So compare that to Sydney. Pretty much all the way through, results for 2021 are better than 2020. And again, early on there, they were on par or better than pre-COVID in 2019. And then they've dropped away, but again, not as significant as, say, Sydney or Melbourne, some of those other lockdown or impacted areas. And then the last one, if you go to the next slide. So this is regional Western Australia, for example. So where you've had a long period where there's no COVID, and you've got that restrictions lifted, all those sorts of pieces, so they can't go overseas, and not going interstate either. So guess where they're going? Regional WA, and for most of this period, it's actually better, not only than 2020, but better than 2019. And one of the impacts here that you might look at the yellow and go, well, 2020, it's actually much higher than the pre-COVID period. That's because they had a bumper period in 2020 as well, in between the first outbreak and the next lot. So they were actually going on very well. So that's what I was talking about, from the point of view of the messaging around the country being very different, depending on where you're at and also where your market is. So for example, for the ACT at the moment, their market is all pretty much Sydney, regional New South Wales and Melbourne. So they're down like over 90% for the recent month. So heavily impacted there. But I think the message here is the conditions are right, with, using myself as an example, I've got a lot of leave build up. There's a bit of money in the bank because I haven't been traveling and spending on other things. We've got lockdown fatigue. People are busting to get out and have a holiday. We've got the holiday season coming up. We've also got the combination of people being a little bit cautious about going overseas. So I think we're going to see that transition, as we've seen in previous recoveries. You've got that drive market, the interstate drive market, and then it'll feed into the interstate and the fly market, and then you'll get those longer durations of stay, and the biggest spend is the pattern that we've seen in the past. So that's a very quick summary and an overview. There's so much data that I could have looked at. There's bits and pieces. If you've got questions, I can sort of come back to you offline as well. But that's just a quick summary from me. As I said, it looks positive, and let's hope that with the vaccines and everything, we come out of this lockdown period and go into a bumper holiday season.
Rod, can I just ask a question? You mentioned that VFR might be probably the way that people you feel might be going first of all.
Yeah.
What sort of stats have you got on that, and what sort of summary have you come to that conclusion from?
So what we've seen with the VFR was with reference to the international travel. So I think when people look to go outbound, and we've seen that the motivation with COVID still hanging around and people are a little unsure, that's been the strongest motivation is family. And so the holidays and business and other things have taken a back seat to that travel. So that has always been, when we've had bubbles and with New Zealand and those bits and pieces, it's the VFR that's come first. That's been first and foremost, pretty much. So it looks to me like that will be the same. You've got to have a strong motivation to jump on a long haul flight during the current period, and so that's what we've seen is the motivation is VFR.
Sorry, and just to finish off on that question, do you feel that there's going to be, and I'm not sure if your data shares this information or not, but do you feel like there might be a trepidation because of a sort of resurgence in COVID? Like, is there any sort of data on that?
No, this is all new to us. So everything has been, as with everybody else, we've sort of it's bounced around, and as I said, from state to state, city to city, the story is different depending on your situation. But I think it's a little bit different this time because of the high vaccination rates. Let's see what happens. I mean, with Sydney, we're not seeing the numbers, and let's hope that those numbers don't go back up. And hopefully in Melbourne they're stabilising. And I think there was the mobility data is also showing there was some lockdown fatigue with people not necessarily abiding by all the lockdown rules. So I think there's that really strong motivation to get out and have a holiday and travel. That's what I think is going to be the overarching thing coming into the holiday season.
What's happening in Canberra, Rod, with it? Are you still getting the cases there?
You
got the highest vaccination rates going. What are the cases?
Yeah, I think there was 9 or 12 the last time I looked at it. The numbers are quite small. They've never really. We've had the odd spike up to 50, but it was hanging around 30 for quite a while. And the majority of those were in the unvaccinated group still. So, I'm pretty sure it was 12. Yesterday or the day before the last time I looked at it.
Looking at the Sydney compared to WA, they're chalk and cheese. WA has been the first state always to shut the borders and everything like that. With the data coming from Sydney, is that along the same lines as Melbourne, or is Melbourne completely different?
Melbourne and Sydney are pretty much very similar in the terms of the losses they've seen. I don't have that with me. I just grabbed a few slides to sort of show, two very different stories. So I picked Sydney and Perth, but Melbourne's numbers are pretty bad in terms of what their losses have been. But they also had, their story looks a little bit different because they also had that very protracted outbreak in 2020. So their numbers look a bit better 2021 compared to 2020 because they had those worst results in that period. But at the moment, they're pretty similar to Sydney. And if you look at the data, our August data is coming out next Friday, the 5th of November. So if you go to the TRA website, there's actually some Excel spreadsheets there with a workbook with separate spreadsheets in there, and it actually splits by month throughout the whole year. Sydney versus New South Wales, rest of New South Wales, Melbourne versus regional Victoria, and so on all the way through. So if you go onto our website next Friday, you'll get that updated all the way through to August, and it has the capital city regional splits.
Okay, that's fantastic. That'll actually be really good. I'll definitely download that and put it out to our members so they can see the information as well, and hopefully seeing that curve come back up towards the positives, heading towards this Christmas period.
Yep, and so as I said, that trip rate chart is it's in our HTML page on our website, and all the other information is available through the Excel workbooks that we have there. And it's monthly data, as I said, updated to the end of August, and the trip rates will be, I think, almost it will be the 4th week of October by that comes out. So just a few days short of the 4 month of October when you see that. So that'll have a bit over 2 full weeks of the lockdown restrictions coming off.
Wonderful. Any other questions from any of the other Zoomers?
That's very good. Very good.
Thank you, Rod. Thanks.
No problems. And if you ever need anything, if you want to pass on my contact details, if people have questions in relation to the data at all, I'm often around, and in my new role, I'm looking to get out into the regions a bit more and talk to people, not only about the results during COVID. I'm actually working on, it's only a 1-page summary, but looking at local government areas. So profiling that and we're going to update those every 6 months during the recovery as we come out of COVID.
Fantastic.
So data for LGAs.
Brilliant. Next year, Rod, we've got an event coming up in Narrandera. I'd love to speak to you about that as well.
Sounds good.
It's for all industry, so it'll be hopefully quite informative, and just going off what you discussed in the last half an hour, I think that that would be fantastic if we could
It's a good opportunity to share some of the new things we're doing as well. So our surveys are world class, and we've had an opportunity to compare those with telco data. We're doing some things in that space, mobile apps, and also we've been working with the RBA, Treasury, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So we've been able to compare our national visitor spend results with the RBA data, which collects 98.5% of all the bank transactions. So it's good to see that the surveys stack up and the trends follow. So we're using some of that bank data for macro level information, because it's you can't define tourism properly and a few other things, but there's a few other data sources which can give us a heads up and a leading indicator of what's happening.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. We will definitely send your details around to everybody, and also the links to your site. And I think everyone will be very happy to get that more regular resource as well. So thank you so much.
No trouble, anytime. And yeah, I'd love to hear about the event in Narrandera as well. So
absolutely right. I'll be in touch.
all right, thanks, mate. Good on you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Nadine.
Thank you.